now like to welcome our last panel of today and also our commemoration. It is titled China, Afro-America, and Our Fight for Democracy and Peace. The moderator will be Sophie Hirt, and the panelists will be Caleb Chen, Serafina Harris, and Arthur Robinson.
I'm very excited to announce the last panel of today's program and of our 25th commemoration of the 100th anniversary of the Communist Party of China. The panel is titled China, Afro-America, and Our Fight for Democracy and Peace. Through this panel, we bring the rise of China and the darker nations of the world back home to America. Amidst an America lost in war, violence, and poverty, where the youth face miseducation, anxiety, and nihilism, we ask the question of what the rise of China can mean for young people today and for the future of humanity in our common fight for peace and democracy. The young person searching for purpose today in society often becomes lost and disillusioned due to the anti-human culture of the ruling elite that is popularized on social media and in universities, the most influential places young people turn to for community and a sense of identity. So much of the art produced by and for our generation reflects a deep sense of individualism and cynicism, selfishness and non-struggle. We discover that knowledge can bring us fame, wealth, and material comfort, but our souls know that there has to be a truth that we cannot find in the mainstream. As we have discussed throughout the conference, we believe that the future of America and the uplift of humanity depends on the humanistic traditions of the Black freedom movement in its essence and in its ties to the strivings of the dark, oppressed masses of the world. For a generation who has known war for most of our lives and faces a moral crisis, how are we to envision the future for the world we are inheriting? We have a wealth of lessons to draw from the example of the CPC and other revolutionary movements, especially our own civil rights movement. The traditions of the Black freedom struggle and the shared strivings of the Chinese and the American people are our inheritance and our responsibility to learn from and bring back to people in this time. The revolution of values that King urged America to undergo is our project to continue today, to inject dignity back into a collapsing civilization and build anew. The principles we live by are developed from spirituality, art and culture, and ideology. Each of the panelists today will present on one of these topics and how it is significant for building a revolution of values and inter-civilizational unity with the rest of the world. To begin, I'd like to introduce Caleb Chen, a member of the Saturday Free School and a recent college graduate living in Philadelphia. His presentation will be speaking on the synthesis of Marxism, Maoism, Confucianism, and the Black radical tradition for a new China and world.
Can everyone hear me all right? Okay. I actually started writing out my speech last night, and it was really focused on the philosophy of like mainland New Confucians and the Chinese New Left. But I decided like that felt too philosophically abstract for like what we're trying to talk about here today. And I think it really like is. I think I was thinking about it through just these past 2 weekends, and I mean I really wanted to thank like all the hands and all the organizers who put this together. I mean, being able to see someone like Lily and the choices she's made, and like I felt very, very moved. But it's something that I think is the heart of what I want to talk about today in Afro-America, in China, because one of the things that I think has made such an impression on me has been the fact that I've never gotten a chance to understand China except through the free school. I think I've never been outside the country before. I've never been to China. I haven't really been outside of Pennsylvania for a long time either. But I think it's realizing this connection, this intercivilizational connection between Afro-America, between China, and realizing that there is something like in this heart of the soul, in the soul of, I mean, these traditions, in the soul of the philosophy we're trying to fight for here today, and that the free school is the cradle for like this new synthesis. And I just want to say that my presentation here today has been inspired in large part by Doc's and Emily's presentation from last night. I think it was in the ideas and the framing, and in the spirit of what they hoped to reach with their presentation that made me realize my own task. And it was in talking with Michelle to help pry me away from my own tendency for bookishness and clear away the uncertainties regarding the more preeminent questions. I think most of all, with all the past conferences, dinners, meetings, and numerous conversations I've had with members of the free school, it's only out of this context, out of this struggle, that I feel halfway ready to stand here and speak today. I take immense courage from this. So today I really wanted to talk about, like Sophie said, the synthesis, the three traditions in China that, I mean, people define in multiple ways. People see it as balancing things and separated. You know, Chinese Marxism or just Chinese communism in general. And then there's the Enlightenment tradition. And then Confucianism and ancient Chinese civilization. But the one thing I really wanted to focus on is that the idea of unifying the three traditions, which was introduced by Gang Yang. He was Gan Yang, actually. He is a political philosopher in China. I believe a dean at Sun Yat-sen University. And he said they unified the three traditions, which he gave in a lecture, Tong San Tong, emerges from an essay written by Gan Yang, which electrified the intellectual community in China. In the pursuit of a philosophical tradition, carry with them the possibility of reimagining the future developments of China. Many scholars in the month and years following the essay's publication tried their hand at envisioning what these traditions might be, some of which have further included, some of which has included Confucianism, Maoism, Daoism, the Enlightenment traditions. But what is less important is expending time on exactly identifying what these traditions must be and slotting them into one of the three. Such an exercise becomes formulated and escapes the more fundamental questions that prompted the necessity of such a framework. And I think it's less of what a lot of intellectuals in China, from my impression, are trying to do, which is defining the exact three of these traditions, but more just understanding why this context is so important, where intellectuals and political theorists, activists, bloggers in China are actively trying to reimagine and understand what this China's rise means for today. Because it's not an easy question to answer. And I take a lot of reassurance from the fact that Gan Yang talked about how for understanding China, the Chinese least of all understand China as a whole. That the idea, the history, the civilization is so large and so vast to understand, like, what does it mean for its rise, for its history, for its principles today. It takes more than just a single opinion, but it takes struggle of being able to synthesize and understand China's own history and its connections with the rest of the world. And I think that's something that I think is so important for today, but to understand that these traditions, that something like the Black radical tradition is so necessary for China even today, and its connections with Afro-America through ropes, through his travels there around China, through Du Bois' own travel there and commemoration, and even from Chinese citizens like Bing Xing, who commemorated and honored Du Bois, realized that Afro-America and China both have a shared history, that they're intertwined. And one of the things that moved me reading and studying, like trying to figure out this idea of Afro-America and China, was reading a quote, I think, by Huey, where he said he took a lot of guidance from Miles' quote that I think to die as a reactionary is to die lighter than a feather, but to die as a revolutionary for the revolution, it's heavier than one's high. To realize that this responsibility and this burden, like it's incumbent on us, I mean as young people today, but even just as seeing ourselves as part of progressive humanity. Like what is our task and what is our responsibility today to understand China's rise and to understand its connections with Afro-America. And I also, something that really, I think distinctly, maybe emotional, like in this research, was finding out that now China with its material growth, like with the vast potential and with gangs reforming, opening up, that there's still a profound spiritual crisis happening in China. That young people here in China, like share so many of the anxieties and eroticisms that young Americans here experience. To know that young professionals in China, that there's something called "nedran," just like translated literally means inside rotating, inside revolution, involution, meaning that the lives feel empty for a lot of young Chinese, that they feel professional, they feel accomplished, but there's nothing out of their lives that can come out today. Even young Chinese who feel like lying flat is the only way for them to perceive life, that there is no higher reach for them. And I think that for me, I can't necessarily say, I think it made me think a lot about three dimensions, King's idea of this higher reach, this height of life, and what does something like three dimensions mean for China? What can it mean for the integration of like a new system of values, a new revolution of values for China? And that China has modernized and Deng has brought wealth to China. But now it's like this spiritual evolution, what happens now for a spiritual civilization. And like new values always come regardless of whether or not we're searching for them out. And I think China is in the process of a search through Confucianism, through reviving old traditions, and I think the direction of China that the nation will take matters a lot. Understanding that. Yeah, I think that feels profoundly important. Trying to synthesize the Black radical tradition of Black freedom movement with China today and her traditions, and it's something that feels deeply personal to me to know that I feel so much more of a connection to China that I've never felt before, ever in my life, really. I think knowing that it was through free school, it was through like understanding the history and the moral traditions and China and this wide land that we can understand what our responsibilities are here today. And I think, being able to see something like Confucianism, that it's connected, the idea of humanity, of benevolence. There's a universal love that binds all in a single garden of destiny, and peace and compassion are the soul that bind people together, and that this becomes a basis for a civilization. That something like this feels so much in the vein of like human traditions, the Gandhian love ethic, and King's own idea of agape love, and how someone like Sun Yat-sen from the Enlightenment tradition, a revolutionary Democrat, but also a Christian, educated and wide, whose devotion to God and truth saw China's salvation and the Chinese people standing up against the imperial powers. And also in Chinese communism, embodied by Mao, Deng, Zhou Enlai, but most of all the Long Marchers, who find their steps echoed in the thousands led by Gandhi in defiance of the British Raj, and their spiritual resilience in Montgomery, and a people who found new meaning and dignity in non-cooperation. I think it's a struggle to be able to see China's rise and Afro-America together. It's a struggle of, seeing the ideological connections and the responsibilities we have, but also how we fit into this also. And I think the one thing that the struggle entails, I believe, is being able to fight back against the nihilism that seems to feel so prevalent, but also being able to see how integral these new values are. And I think, these profound connections for all the history of these moral civilizations and movements, and being able to see the connections and feel them, but also feel like we can apply them. I think it's one of the tasks for us today, is seeing China and Afro-America as having a shared history, as being bound in the same environment, and knowing that the way forward for China is that China needs the Black African tradition, and Afro-America needs China, and together there is a shared human tradition, a long history that can bring us forward to what King calls a beloved community, to the lower house. I'd like to end it right there. Thank you so much.
Caleb, and before moving on, something I was struck by in Caleb's presentation is, in a lot of ways, the way we're ending this conference is the way we started, about the rediscovery of China through the Black Freedom Movement and what that means for all of America. And also something I was struck by in what Caleb said is that you don't have to go to China to understand its significance for us today. And in the future we're building in the uplift of humanity, and how free schools become a home for so many of us as young people from all over, different backgrounds and ethnicities, but that we are trying to do, as Caleb brought up about King, build a world house in a beloved community where people can coexist together and live in peace. And it makes me really excited for what this conference will bring for us. So next I'd like to introduce Serafina Harris, who is an artist and a member of the Free School, and her presentation will be on art and the uplift of peace, democracy, and solidarity.
In explaining jazz, Baldwin describes this point about music of Black people, that, quote, "This music begins on the auction block. Music is our witness, our ally. The beat is a confession which recognizes, changes, and conquers time. Then history becomes a garment which we can wear and share, not a cloak in which to hide, and time becomes a friend." In Agnes Smedley's The Great Road, The Life and Times of Chute clarifies the purpose of history as an important tool for revolutionary theory, practice, and ideological development. She writes that Karl Marx declared in 1857 that the Taiping Uprising was a popular war for the maintenance of Chinese nationality, and that in a popular war, the means used by the insurgent nation cannot be measured by the commonly recognized rules of regular warfare, nor by any other abstract standard, but by the degree of civilization only attained by that insurgent nation. The very fanaticism of the Southern Chinese, Marx further wrote, in their struggle against the foreigners, seemed to mark a consciousness of the supreme danger in which old China was placed. The death struggle of the oldest empire in the world was taking place, he declared, and a new era was opening in all Asia. Through Chute, we learned that the length of the struggle for freedom in China stretches over centuries. It becomes clear that the centrality of the Chinese struggle for peace and self-determined civilization that is tied to the freedom of the rest of Asia and its consequential revolutions. Further, due to the amount of time the struggle in China has taken in its process, lessons can be learned for the armies of communist China. To quote, "Here are Taiping dead, wailing at the tattooed river, crossing it over the town where they were slaughtered, and their wail until they are avenged. Then their spirits will rest." In still another article, Marx made the startling statement, not even thought of by the Taipings, that the Taiping Revolution was the first cry in the creation of the Chinese Republic, and that it had already begun to write the words of freedom, equality, and love of others over the doors of that republic. The Taipings failed, General Chen said, but the Chinese communists had learned from their mistakes and would never repeat them. In this time of this country and in politics, history becomes the first point of contention. It is either we are now to be in the past because there is no present, and wear expensive clothing imitating a time where life seemed to be good for the most part, or brand ourselves on social media in the form of an angry radical with hair products to boot, and we attempt to try something new. This attempt, still, though it is an attempt, can fall flat because the ruling class has attempted to obscure the lines between good and bad, progressive and regressive. The revolutions in the 20th century in America was hindered and broken apart by interests of American imperialism and war. And similar to the winners of the Taiping Revolution, history is obscured by the interests antagonistic to the people. So by what basis do we perceive ourselves at this time? How do we build ourselves? Up upon what foundation? What really are our roots? It is one thing to be reminiscent and like the songs of Marvin Gaye, but it is another thing to ask what he asks and what people are still asking, what's going on? It is at this point of reality where one must point out the lie of the reassuring history that America has progressed to the point where one does not have to work, where there is no struggle, and we are beyond history itself, where there must be no racial conflict. One has to, instead of escaping our history, face the music, as Baldwin points out while describing this birth of jazz. He writes that jazz bears witness to one of the most obscene adventures in the history of mankind. It is a music which creates what we call history with a capital H, that cannot sum up the courage to do the response to the most absolutely universal question of who am I and what am I doing here? And Baldwin would continue to ask in this regard, how does a singer like Nina Simone, or Ray, Miles, and so on, did and do confront this question and, quote, make that captivity a song? Baldwin writes thusly, so much for the European vanity, which imagines that the single word history controls the past and defines the present, and therefore cannot but suppose that the future will prove to be as willing to be brought into captivity as the slaves they imagined themselves to have discovered as the nigger they had no choice but to invent. This invention, Baldwin warns, will describe you, but will certainly betray you, which I agree that it does, because the history of a people can be lied about to control public opinion. People can succumb to moral and psychological degradation, which causes internal strife between man, woman, and child, and inspire insecurities towards the inner self. We, Black, white, South American, Asian Americans, have come not to recognize ourselves and do not see ourselves in the world. There is similarly no vision to struggle out of a counter-revolutionary basis. Where could this vision stem from? As the boys would write in The World in Africa, that China is flesh of your flesh. Africa is blood of your blood. China is colored and knows what a colored skin in this modern world subjects its owner. But China knows more, much more than this. She knows what to do about it. She can take the insults of the United States and still hold her head high. She can make her own machines or go without machines. When America refuses to sell her American manufacturers, even though this throws her workers out of jobs and hurts American industry. China does not need American, nor British missionaries to teach her religion and scare her with tales of hell. China has been in hell too long, not to believe in a heaven of her own making. This she is doing. A synthesis emerges of the values in the world revolutionary process of the 20th century, if understood in its proper context of the struggle for peace, justice, and coexistence. This is the foundation that world humanity can grow and flourish. It is a synthesis of the specific nature of struggle per nation that it befits, that reality, or to have an idea of what reality is, emerges. And though civilizations vary and its nations are different, it is the values and the lifeboats of people that tie human beings to reality to find meaning. One can understand, as Baldwin says, that the dangers of being an American artist are not greater than they are being an artist anywhere else in the world, but they are very particular. These dangers are produced by our history. This false history rests on the fact that there is no human. If there is human rooted in a particular civilization, the realization of oneself emerges as a key to peace. And similarly, there's a calm that overtakes Baldwin's statement as it furthers itself in states of a particular aloneness, which I speak, the aloneness in which one discovers that life is tragic, and therefore unutterably beautiful. Du Bois states that this would take a new way of thinking on Asiatic lines to work this out, but there would be a chance that out of India, out of Buddhism and Shintoism, out of the age-old virtues of Japan and China itself, to provide for this different kind of communism, a thing which so far all attempts at a socialistic state in Europe have failed to produce. That is, a communism with its Asiatic stress on character, on goodness, on spirit through family loyalty and affection, might roar of Thermidor, might stop the tendency of the Western soloistic state to freeze into bureaucracy. It might be through the philosophy of Gandhi and Tagore, of Japan and China, to really create a vast democracy into which the ruling class, the ruling dictatorship of the proletariat would use and viliplace. I apologize. And thus, instead of socialism ever becoming a stark negation of freedom of thought and tyranny of action and propaganda of science and art, it would expand into a great democracy of the spirit. For example, the Harlem Renaissance would be understood by its historical context, its substance, which it does not lack. The Harlem Renaissance was a period of American culture that reached its apex due to the ongoing struggle for manhood, freedom, against war and poverty. The artists themselves not only were some tied to struggle in actual terms, but were a few generations away from slavery. Paul Robeson said it himself in an interview in 1958 that he was born on the edge of Robeson County, and my father is a Robeson and was a Robeson because he was a slave. My own father, a slave of the Scottish Robesons, who still controls Robeson County in North Carolina. This is why, Robeson says, that he approaches the problems of war, poverty, and racism from a very close point. But, he continues to say, I have a home, and my people are tobacco workers and sharecroppers today in that county, but a part of that soil belongs to me. Those are my roots. Paul Paul Robeson would have a context in which he emerges that makes sense, which is from the freedom struggle of America and the various struggles in the world. This would give reason to the purpose of him singing folk songs of the people, songs of work and toil, suffering and love of China, Russia, Africa, the Eastern Europeans and Slavs. Robeson emerges from a multi-generational struggle against slavery, just as China was struggling against feudalism and the drudgery of the lack of dignity and poverty. The importance of Huan Zhen as an artist in the Long March is the fact that the Long March was the birthplace of civilization of modern China. Zhen himself was grounded in the philosophy of art that is centered on ancient traditions of Buddhism and Confucius. These grounding philosophies create a worldview of how to create art and are guiding principles to define the difference between truth and untruth, which are the same guiding principles to look at history and the figures of history. And this goes for those in the Black arts movement. Sculptor Augusta Savage, writer Vincent Hughes, Anil Kapuya, Marian Anderson, Mahalia Jackson, all stem from struggle. All the depict struggle for the Black arts movement would be a synthesis of the tradition and civilizations of Black people that is grounded on the fundamental values of American democracy, as well as Black folk specifically. It is a distortion and whitewashing of this fact that creates James Baldwin to be just a gay writer when he is a man of values that are comprehensive, or ignore the contribution of Dr. W.B. Du Bois's life to be rather understood as a Black writer who attempted to become white. Instead of the responsibility to know these culture bearers as they would be placed in history as fighters for peace and justice, as men and women striving for a better civilization. This is of the utmost importance. If we have a true understanding of them, we can remember who America really is. We can understand ourselves by an honest look of these figures and be able to create as artists are able to do, and more importantly, allow people relief and have a revitalization of the soul. These artists who are lost to the present generation, like painters Charles White and Norman Lewis, Romare Bearden and Aaron Douglas, singers like Nina Simone, Aretha Franklin, The Temptations, they could be taken seriously and loved if we truly knew them and wanted to know whence they came. To move forward as a human beings, we must learn from our past. The theater would rock, alive with the human need to express ideas of man and democracy. Painting would be alive and narrate the stories of old to the young. Music would reconcile life and press on with love as its driving force. Writing would be precognitive, and I think science would be too. Education would be the foremost mission of democracy in the United States instead of war and profit, because life would be expended to the immortal child, as Du Bois writes. We would be living in a life world that would seek, or that would quote seek, not to make men carpenters, but to make carpenters men. Men would have reason to live, and their children would have a purpose and future. Lorraine Hansberry would also be heard, with her question posed in a short story entitled, "What Are the Use of Flowers?" This is a story of a hermit finding children, or children finding a hermit, after a bomb had killed the rest of humanity. And as a man who will attempt to teach civilization upon these children, teach the human experiment driven by his own will to live, though he thinks he's failed in this attempt and still answers these questions posed by the children with the response. Why, the use of flowers? Well, there were in the old days certain perfectly tasteless individuals who insisted on making wine out of them, but that was not a use, it was a violation. Ah, but the use of flowers are infinite. One can smell them, one may touch their petals and feel heaven, or one may write quite charming verses about them. To deal with reality and to have a vision that inspires people to the future, one has to be grounded by what came before, to define the present, because it is the responsibility of the artist to also attempt to say something to people, and to speak even when other people cannot. culture, as Henry Winston states, is derived in the main from the experience of blacks in the struggle for freedom. White supremacy and Western civilization in this moment is in decline. And so it is in this struggle with the reality and our historic moment that would encourage the rise of the true renaissance of humanity and the rise of beauty would occur. Thank you.
Thank you, Serafina. Finally, I'd like to introduce our last panelist, who is Arthur Robinson, a member of the Saturday Free School and an actor. Religious traditions in Afro-America and China.
Good evening, everyone. Afternoon. I was struck by Jeremiah, something you said at the end of your presentation on Xi Jinping, speaking about the idea of reaching towards the sky and this concept of, and it says, spiritual support between nations, between civilizations. And it struck me because, to a great degree, that's what my presentation is about. It's about the idea of gaining spiritual support and looking to civilizations, specifically two very great and profound civilizations, the Afro-American civilization, the civilization of Asia and China. And I'd like to start by predicating that in Buddhist tradition, which is one of the primary traditions I will be citing a lot of in this presentation, we are taught to examine the conditions that give rise to certain phenomena. Everything that exists that we can see or feel or touch, we look at and try to understand what makes that that. The self is not exempt. Things that are both material and immaterial. Verse 60 of the Dhammapada, which is a collection of sayings attributed to the Buddha, reads, "Long is the night for the sleepless. Long is the road to the weary traveler. Long is the cycle of samsara, rebirth, to the unwise, who do not know the truth." From two great civilizations in the world arise immensely similar conclusions about the true nature of humanity and its destiny on this world and the universe. From the Afro-American tradition, thinkers like Du Bois, Martin Luther King Jr., Huey Newton, Paul Robeson, peered into the depths of their own struggles, their own people's struggles, and through it saw the greater struggle interwoven amongst all peoples. Their guiding ideas and principles arrive in the same vein and trajectory of centuries of progress from the spiritual thinkers of the East, from the simple and yet profound notion that as humans, we are responsible for the well-being of other humans, and that the universe's natural order dictates that our destiny is to live in communion and harmony with one another and for one another, to remove boundaries which keep us from each other, to give up selfish things like conflict, ego, suffering. It's easy and indeed somewhat commonplace for people my age to state that they live selflessly and have committed their lives for their fellow man. We see that all the time, and we're constantly inundated with it, especially on social media. I would assume most of us are here today because we see that the world suffers and we want to find our remedies for it. And in this age, in this generation, our vision of humanity somewhat is obfuscated because we don't have a clear vision of what the rest of the world and what makes the rest of the world human. We don't even have a clear vision of really what makes us and ourselves human, what our birthright is as a human. And even for those of us who actively pursue and desire a life devoid of ego, bound to the ideals of oneness and interbeing with others, the path has been purposefully made in many ways insidiously unclear. It's easy to say, I have arrived at these ideals and now can show others the way, but we are the product of this moment's very anti-human conditions. When we suffer, when we feel anger, violence, anguish, or conflict with others, in Buddhism, we understand that most often it is because we are attached to something, in many ways our own ego. And it's because of this that we feel that we cannot escape from this suffering. Verse 5 of the Dhammapada reads, "Animosity does not eradicate animosity. Only by loving kindness is animosity dissolved. This law is ancient and eternal." That will sound very familiar to a lot of people here, as King himself says, "Darkness cannot drive out darkness. Only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate. Only love can do that." As an aside, after King died, was assassinated, a Vietnamese Zen Buddhist monk named Thich Nhat Hanh wrote a letter in which he described how the people of Vietnam, the villagers with whom felt great kinship with King, often spoke of him as Bodhisattva. In Mahayana Buddhist tradition, one who has reached the shore of enlightenment, of nirvana, but understands that his responsibility is not to depart, not to reach that shore immediately, but to go back and help others collectively reach the shore. The cynic, the scholar, and the academic, of course, invariably agree that King has beliefs that align with Buddhist and Vedist tradition. He was inspired by Gandhi so clearly, as he himself says. But King was also the man of towering faith. And true faith, a vast and clear vision of humanity, is universally available to all beings regardless of creed, because true faith is true vision. It allows us to see the divine with which we all contain, with which is our birthright. And still our generation struggles, and our vision is especially unclear. And we have grown up in a pocket of the world where our communities have undergone something of a severe spiritual atrophy. In many cases, such as universities and schools, a full spiritual coma. Its consequences are long, catastrophic, and very readily observable. From the skyrocketing violence we see in urban communities, gun violence, homicide rates, the deep fear parents have for their children going out at night, playing with others. Even the privileged are not exempt. The elite liberal institutions at universities inundate children, youths, with self-loathing, suicidal intent, a complete and utter divorce from hope for anyone, regardless of who they are, let alone ourselves. Instead, many people in my generation have chosen to worship at the altars of nihilism, ego, escapism, the great obstructors of what allows us to reach our true potential as humans. We stare at doomsday clocks, we sit in our beds and hope for the night to end, and we freely wear our mistrust for one another and ourselves as if it is some sort of suffering Olympics. But when we look deeper at our suffering, at the current suffering of our peers, we see these great obstacles are simply that, obstacles. And we know that we must nurture transformation, unity, vision, and how blessed we are that the remedies for such illnesses are all still available for us from these two great civilizations, honed and refined over their long trajectory from the cradle of Buddhist, Hindu, Taoist, Shinto civilization to the great synthesizers of King, to Robeson, to Du Bois. In particular, I will reference the three dimensions of life quite often, as I find it to be quite a seminal Buddhist text in many ways. All things mentioned in it are so remarkably harmonious and translatable to the thought that it quite frankly humbles me. We can begin with one of the first and easiest observable instances of illnesses, and that is the self. We're a generation of simultaneously self-serving and self-loathing children. We all feel, and I mean all of us, unless some of you have figured out something that I haven't in the last few moments and attained nirvana, we are inundated with suffering. We feel we are not enough. We are given messaging and branding to remedy this with things like self-care, which really equates to self-numbing and isolation. We are given excuses to shift the responsibility of what makes us suffer, of what brings us harm. We're told that's other people. We're all introverts at heart or something. We need to take time to recuperate from our social functions. And we've been confused to see self-reflection and self-compassion as extensions of these same baseless, obstructive, hollow forms of selfishness that are manufactured all around us. Self-numbing would teach us to meet our negative feelings like anger, jealousy, fatigue, with selfish, massaging behavior. It's all right that I feel that. It's good that I feel that. I am allowed to be angry and vindictive and hateful towards my fellow man. But true self-compassion gives us the courage to look inward and ask the question of why. Why do I resent my friends? Why am I jealous of my peers? Why can I not let go of the deep anger I feel? And self-compassion mandates that you treat these feelings with hope, with acceptance, but also the knowledge that they may be transformed, that you may move beyond them to become who you are meant to be, that these negative parts of yourself are not your true nature, that you become unmuddled enough from your ego to see what opportunity and potential God has given you and what currently holds you back from reaching it. From MLK, we discover this through the length of life. He says, we have a legitimate right to be concerned about ourselves, and we must be so concerned about ourselves that we set out early in life to discover what we are made for God has called us all up to do something. From verse 67 of the Tao Te Ching, simplicity, patience, compassion. These three are your greatest wonders. Simple in action and thoughts, you return to the source of being, patient with both friends and both enemies. You accord with the way things are, compassionate toward yourself, you reconcile all beings in the world. And very, very quickly from the Dhammapada, stronger than the man who conquers 1,000 in battle is the man who conquers himself. And to return to King for the last and perhaps my favorite little concise quote of his from The Length of Life. If you aren't concerned about yourself, you aren't really going to be concerned about other selves. To look inward and reflect with compassion is to tap into our own humanity and its limitless energy, the way it motivates you, forces you to connect to the rest of the world. It is, in short, not an empty love of looking at your reflection and finding yourself pleasant to look at. It is looking inward and knowing you have responsibility to yourself. You cannot run from your own suffering so much as you can run from your own shadow. And from that remedy, we find the dignity and care with which you are owed, which we are all owed. How is it that we can take on the responsibility of our fellows when we are unwilling to take on any responsibility for ourselves? When we'll commit such grievous harm inward, use such violence, that we break with our own trust time and time again. Oh, I'm not like that usually. Oh, it was a bad moment for me. Oh, I was drunk, or I needed to let loose for a while. We have to have responsibility for ourselves so that we can trust ourselves. The friend who breaks a promise 1,000 times, you would not trust. You break your own promises to yourself 1,000 times, you won't trust. We have to reach inward. We have to look at these perceived failures and give ourselves the hand we need to lift ourselves towards our potential. Shame and self-loathing are dissolved when we can understand that we are capable of more. We can reach higher. The great obstructors for clearing our vision towards our humanity dissolve. And from seeing ourselves clearly, we then work to unmake the rabid and unchecked ego fed by our current moment. I am very familiar with the feeling of wanting to impose my own enlarged imprint into the world as a somewhat reaction to feeling very small and insignificant in the face of all of its troubles. I became an actor for that very reason. I enjoy applause. They make me feel nice. They make me feel welcome. But Buddhist tradition encourages us to see that the true nature of existence is tied to a concept known as interdependence and no self. That is the realization that the conditions that create all things mean that nothing is completely independent of anything else. We are all tied together. The bread that we eat for breakfast had to be baked. The wheat had to be farmed. The farm had to be watered. The farmer himself had to be born and fed in an unending cycle. And speaking more directly, someone had to care for us when we were a helpless child. And whoever did that too required someone to care for them. How can it be that we say humans do not care for each other when our entire existence is predicated on such a thing? In examining how many conditions had to be met, how many things had to go properly for us to exist, to speak the way we do, we better understand how completely bound we are to one another and how if one thing is removed or damaged or changed, another thing surely is also damaged, removed, and changed. That someone else's suffering is our suffering, and vice versa, our suffering is theirs. Remove the water and no wheat grows, no wheat, no bread, starvation. And therefore, what responsibility we must have outside of ourselves to these conditions, to these great webs of interweaving things. This idea of interdependence is near indistinguishable from what King describes as the breath of life, mankind's willingness to rise outside of the self and work for the benefit of all humanity. Now, he says, he was good because he had the capacity to project the I to the thou. He was good because he could rise above the length of life and incorporate the breadth. His discussion on the Good Samaritan, the ability to not think, what will happen to me if I get out and help this man, but instead, what will happen to what will happen to the man? I got a little mixed up, but more concretely from his letter from Birmingham jail, a quote you have heard many, many times this evening and perhaps the last few weeks. I am cognizant of the interrelatedness of all communities and states. I cannot sit idly by in Atlanta and not be concerned about what happens in Birmingham. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. And this too gives us a remedy for something Du Bois reflects upon in The World in Africa, his presentation of imperialism's great crimes, not only in its cruelty, but its ability to obfuscate and disconnect the communities and civilizations of the world from one another. In chapter 2, he writes, upon reflecting on the nature of a young woman playing piano in England, the frightful paradox that is the indictment of modern civilization and the cause of its moral collapse is that a blameless, cultured, beautiful young woman in London may be the foundation on which is built the poverty and degradation of the world. For this, someone is guilty as hell. Spirituality, when ingrained in everyday life, brings us closer to that true vision of the world, to seeing it the way God intends, with all of its many, many interwebbing parts. When we surrender ourselves to something higher, the people and actions we see every day become miraculous and worthy of loving, and not only worthy of loving, but worthy of protecting. This too brings grief, because we see the cruelties, the injustices, the way wrong has been brought into the world we care for. And there is many a time when we look at the vastness of the world, and by extension, the vastness of its many, many contradictions, and its many ills, and say, that is too much. I give up. I cannot do this. We can see in our minds somewhere that we are able to change some things, but that the bigger things are somehow beyond our grasp. And this is the illness of nihilism, rearing its ugly head, and fear that things don't change, fear that we cannot make such great impacts and strivings for the world. But faith is, in its most base of terms, trust. And trust sometimes is described as blind, but I will posit that trust comes at its strongest when we gain a greater understanding of things, when we observe how the world works, how nature functions, how people function, and we begin to understand that there is something that binds us all together, a commonality in our nature. Belief becomes a catalyst at gaining deeper insight into the truth of the world. We observe what happens when we touch our own humanity. We feel how joyous it is when we are enveloped with one another, and conversely how painful it is when we are self-serving, self-loathing, distracted and cut off and in discord with one another. So the natural conclusion we reach from these observations bring us to the same conclusions as a Siddhartha, as a Lao Tzu, as a king, and those who follow revolutionary action into the most dire circumstances, beyond the realm of fear, only in the realm of hope. That at its core, the true nature of the universe and those living within it are just. That God watches over us when we are tired. That the gross calamity of imperialism, war, and violence and servitude are aberrations that we must unmake. That we have been given all the divine tools to heal this world and one another. That life is holy, our commitment to us that will bring it nothing but joy. And what else but this kind of faith can inspire the peasant to take up arms against the oppressor, for thousands to march 6,000 miles across a nation, to cross mountains, wilderness, starvation, onto something that many would call uncertain, being unable to see what is across that mountain, whether or not it's nothing, whether or not it's despair, defeat, but to know with every fiber of your being that on the other side, of course, is victory, is justice, is freedom, the liberation from all suffering that we are owed, nirvana, heaven, light everlasting. From the height of life, King says, first, I think that this cause is right, and since it is right, I believe that God is with it, because God is on the side of right. And therefore, I can go on with the faith, because God is in the struggle for the good life. Victory is inevitable. From the Tao Te Ching, verse 50, I have heard that those who celebrate life walk safely among the wild animals. When they go into battle, they remain unharmed. The animals find no place to attack them, and the weapons are unable to pierce their flesh. Why? Because they can find no place for death within them. As King reflects himself, and the great words of Sister Pollard, the Lord's going to take care of you. When we aren't with you, the Lord is going to take care of you. So today I can face any man and any woman with my feet solidly placed on the ground and my head in the air, because I know that when you are right, God will fight your battle. And from this we can see that we do have such great remedies offered to us through faith. The capacity and tools we need to change ourselves, to transform ourselves, to become who we are destined to be in many ways. We cannot run from our suffering. The longer we run from suffering, the more the world suffers. We have to reject the lie of chaos, deceit, and ego. We have to embrace truth. We have to surrender ourselves to the arms of faith, to seeing something greater than just ourselves, to the divine, to God. And our generation especially is mired with many things that would obstruct this choice. But we see the disastrous consequences when we don't choose it. War, suffering, hatred. And we see so often as well, though, what happens when we do take on this faith. The ability to cross the mountain, the ability to voyage across the sea, to battle something greater than yourself, and to battle yourself. To understand that our birthright, Afro-America's birthright, China's birthright, for humanity, dignity, and compassion, is humanity's birthright. I am now on a passage that I find extremely profound from W.E.B. Du Bois's Dark Princess. I myself have watched as I transform in this life from cynic to believer, as I humble my own distaste for the world into something of hope, as I fashion the despair I used to feel into unwavering joy and resolve for this world and all things on it. And I feel in these moments something that is so difficult to describe in words, but I believe Du Bois describes perfectly in the ending of his book, when the character and protagonist Matthew, who has struggled deeply throughout the book ideologically, spiritually, some would say, and my compatriots, that he whines a lot. When he goes back to his home in Virginia, the humble farm, a place that he has derided very often, not seen the joy, not seen the beauty, the divine in, and writes so often of it with great shame, and therefore cannot find his own place in humanity, until finally he arrives back, and I'm going to give you this passage. Matthew found a seat backward by a window. Leaning out, he spied a boy with lunches hurrying up to the white folks' car. And he induced him to pause and bought a piece of fried chicken and some cornbread that tasted delicious, and then he looked out. Spring sang in his ears, flowers and leaves, sunshine and shade, young cotton and corn. He could not think, he could not reason. He just sat and saw and felt in a tangled jumble of thoughts and words, feelings and desires, dreams and fears. And above it all lay the high heart of determination. They rolled and bumped along. He sat seeing nothing, and yet acutely conscious of every sound, every movement, every quiver of light, the clamor of hail and farewell, the loud, soft, sweet, raucous voices, the movement and stopping, the voices and silence grew to a point so acute that he wanted to cry and sing, walk and rage, scream and dance. He sat tense with half-closed eyes and saw little old Depot dance up upon the far horizon, slip nearer and nearer, and slowly pause with a sighing groan. The sounds fell away and died, and his feet were on the path. His feet were on the path, and the surge of his soul stifled his breath. He saw the wood, the brook, the gate. Beyond was the blur of the dim old cabin, looking wider and larger. Thank you.
Now I invite anyone with comments or questions for the panel to come up to the mic.
All I wanted to say really was like thank you. That panel really touched me like to my heart, and I'm just grateful. So thank you guys for speaking and saying what y'all said. It really touched me. Thank you. That's my heart. Thank you.
Okay, unless anyone else, yeah.
I've already spoken so much, I'm a little hesitant, but of course, what can one say after such a panel? Such depth and probing to find on both the inner and the outer possible solutions to a crisis. And I hope that y'all's words can be made available in multiple ways to not just your generation, but to all of us. And this glad Zay was here because his colleague, Danny Jacobs, last night asked about religion. Is there an inevitable conflict, antagonistic contradiction between communism, or what I would like to call freedom, and religion? Be it Buddhism, Christianity, Judaism, or perhaps it can't be given a name. And I get this from Arthur in his synthesizing Martin Luther King Jr. and Buddhism. I just feel so bad I don't know enough Buddhism. And I think this is part of what because people ask, let me just say, people ask us, when we said we would like to do a commemoration of the 100th anniversary of the founding of the Chinese Communist Party, one of the first questions that we were confronted with is, well, what about Tiananmen Square? And which was another way of saying, well, how can you talk about freedom in a country that is unfree? Because in that country, the people don't have an interior life. They don't have spiritual strivings, and so on and so forth. And I think you all have given us ideas and language to help us go forward and fight for genuine freedom, and to say to people, because American people are religious, even when they're not, they're religious. That what is happening in other parts of the world is not a threat to the religious and spiritual values of this nation and of this civilization. So I thank you guys very, very much. And if you want to comment, I would very much appreciate it.
Yeah, I think what it comes back to with what you're saying is the ideological struggle, and clarifying what has happened, but also to be able to think about an inner life goal, like having that mean something, so you can do things that mean something. So I appreciate the comment on that.
I think I also want to mention, Doc, in your comment that even talking about religion in connection to a commemoration of the CPC probably seems really strange to most people, and certainly most Western leftists. And we've seen an attack on religion from so many sides. And I also was really moved by this panel and by the entire two-week conference, because underlying each person who presented their purpose is a profound desire to connect with humanity and release humanity from suffering. And this is a spiritual endeavor as much as it is a political one. And I am thankful that we are talking about spirituality and religion in also talking about the achievements of the CPC. They're not a contradiction, and they're very interwoven in the world that we're building and in the lessons that we can take from China. Did anyone else have questions or comments that they wanted to bring to the panel?
So my question is not so much related to this panel, but it is an important question that relates to China, African Americans in Africa. What is the role of China in Africa? Because it is confused and misrepresented to me. Anybody else, please speak to me.
Let me say that I have that question too. And at the other panel, when Tony was talking about national liberation movements in Africa not being communist, and most of the members of those parties, those organizations, did not consist of communists. And one thing that came to mind, which might be, connected to what you were asking about, was what motivated the relationship between some national liberation movements to the Soviet Union and some to China? And was it material support? Was it ideological? Was it the focus of the peasant and workers that was closer to the lifestyle of the people in certain African countries? But that's one question that I have. And then, what do you want to say? Do African countries recognize lessons from China? do they, and if so, how? And what is China's role in Africa now versus back in the 1960s and the 70s during the African national liberation struggle?
Catherine and I go back a long time to the solidarity movements with the struggles for liberation in Africa. Often, because that's a question for me. In this current years, 6 of the fastest growing economies in the world are African economies. However, Africa's economic development was set back tremendously as a result of Western connivances and overthrowing of governments. The whole regime change thing that we saw in the early 2000s going forward, Iraq, Syria, Libya, and so on in the Middle East. Well, that happened in the 60s and 70s in Africa. And this was only followed by a century. And I think this is a factor that we have to consider when thinking about how Africa will develop and the obstacles that must be overcome, is the partitioning of Africa. We know about the partition of India, of South Asia, of the Indian subcontinent, and how devastating that was. Well, in the 1880s, in a Berlin conference, Africa was divided up in ways that I don't think it has yet been able to overcome politically. So today, and I say to Steve Rom all the time, there are too many African countries without an answer or way to unite them effectively against neocolonialism and imperialism. And Africa is the most neo-colonized continent in the world. I think all of this is having a very deep effect upon the political and economic development of Africa. Now, the Soviet Union played a very critical role in both the independence movements and the movements for social and ideological development. In other words, the movement towards socialism. The West United States would overthrow any leader or sanction them if they talked about socialism. I think in this new era, beginning in the early 2000s with the Africa-China summits, I think they're still occurring. I don't know. But at that time, all 50 African nations in China would meet to see if there were common grounds of operation. We do know that in many African countries, there are Chinese technicians, there's Chinese investment, and so on. However, it does not seem to be strategic. And I'll just use one example. Probably the richest nation in Africa, maybe the richest nation in the world, is the Congo. If the Congo River were dammed up and could produce electricity, that river alone would produce enough electricity for Africa as a whole. This would, of course, be critical to the industrialization of Africa and everything else. But it would require a level of cooperation and external investment that we just don't see right now. I don't think there's any real obstacle between China and Africa cooperating. That doesn't mean complete agreement, but cooperating for mutual benefit. I always say to Yvonne, who lived for a long time in Africa, that at this point I do not understand Africa. I don't understand the leaders. I don't know intellectuals from Africa. I do know that there's a neo-colonial ideological offensive against Africa. It comes often in the face of Afro-Americans, you know, that is a problem. But I would just say that. I think that is a problem, and that might be the great challenge for humanity in this second half of the 21st century. Because it will take a common all-humanity effort to reclaim Africa from the great devastation of colonialism and the slave trade and neo-colonialism. So I think it is one of those issues, Africa, its development, which will require all humanity type efforts. And that might be the last great challenge in lifting humanity, because as Africa rises, so will Asia, so will humanity.
I got me thinking about, I think what you pointed out earlier today is the, struggle for peace. And that struggle is also what ties, I think, Buddhism to King. I just want to add to that, and to what you're saying, because I think it's the value that come out of that struggle, and that the struggle for peace is also a struggle for unity, which means that despite diversity, there are, there's something that ties humanity together.
Hey Saturday Free School. How's everybody today? So I was sitting in the back and I heard you asking for comments and thoughts on all of this. And so because I'm not really a political person in terms of all the things that you're going to talk about on that side to some degree, because I've been to China. I went to China in '95 to the Women's Beijing Conference and I presented myself, which was food, environment, and women entrepreneurship. Then this event for the last 2 weeks gave me a chance to get in touch with some things. One in terms of the culture at a different level, because when you use food as a vehicle to feed people and relate to their culture, it touches you in different ways too. And so I had to do some research, but some of this was not very new to me because I am a vegan and I eat these things. It just allowed me to expand, and so to understand the transformation and the change. So I really thank the Chinese culture for expanding my mind and thought process and understanding and using food as a vehicle for communications. It is politics, it is a lot of things, and so as a gardener, I was able to relate to it in a lot of ways, and so being associated with Doc over here, and all the time in and around the free school, and being able to share, I hope that my expression of culture and love and caring shown throughout the 2 weeks of the food and the dishes that I prepared and the way that I served them, because all that was new. All that was part of an understanding of the culture and the acceptance. And so it's not all just from a theoretical, political ideology perspective. It is about real, everyday interaction, intervention, and being able to communicate in different ways. So I just wanted to share that with you, and I appreciate all of you. Thank you very much.
Thank you for sharing that, and also for providing us such beautiful presentations of Chinese food the past couple weeks. I really couldn't imagine anything better than what we had from you, so thank you. Okay, are there any other thoughts or questions people would like to share?
Thanks to the panelists for your very great presentations. I wanted to ask if the panelists could elaborate or share their thoughts on the idea that China needs the Black radical tradition today.
No, I just wanted to say something quickly that in Caleb's presentation, he brought up the spiritual crisis that the Chinese youth are in. And it's something that we may not be familiar with firsthand, but as young people and as Americans who faced our own spiritual crises and moral dilemmas, I think it's a really important question to ask: what can China also learn from the Black radical tradition and the traditions of Afro-America and its struggle for freedom?
Sorry, I'm a little tired right now, so I'm probably gonna ramble. I think one of the things that struck me, like trying to understand, like why does China need a Black radical tradition, is I think it's one of the questions where I think with China's rise, like China is still trying to find its identity in some ways too. I mean, with the great material wealth that has been brought upon, it's also brought a lot of its own contradictions too. I mean, there was one article talking about how, in the absence of set moral values and this great prosperity that, you know, with these decades of opening up and economic development, that China had a chance to rise economically, but then, like with it, brought like a lot of decadence too. And I think it poses a similar question to how I think it's what was mentioned yesterday about bringing new meaning and dignity to civilization. And I think that's what the Black radical tradition has, and the capacity of being able to synthesize and integrate with China. And the connections are there. It's understanding how to furnish and continue and carry on these connections. And I think that's one of the biggest tasks for us today, is being able to understand how to carry that forward. And
do my best. I think in delving especially into kind of for me at least, the spiritual tradition that you find in Afro-America, and it's the rigors of completing yourself and finding your dignity in the face of hundreds of years of humiliation and degradation. I think that has something to offer. to China, of course, yes, but to the world in so many ways, right? To be able to find to see so at its cusp the source of suffering and woe in so many ways in this world. It's deep victims especially, but also it's deep the people who triumph over it, the people who looked in the face of it and said, absolutely not, I'm going to keep moving. I'm going to find my dignity. I think of course China has so much to learn from that, and so much to gain from exchanging with that. Those are two civilizations that have had to undergo such intense humiliation at times, and through it found such intense faith and intense dignity.
Yeah, I think that's an important question. In light of the fact that China is also in a stage of its kind of revolutionary process. Is it a new stage or is it a developing stage? That's like, I think a kind of question for me, because I don't know really how the young people in China see the world. I know how Xi Jinping, as we've been discussing, talks about China and its civilization and its importance. And I also can understand from that point of view that at least the young would have there would be an educated youth that I don't see here in America. And I think that it's a situation where American youth need China a lot in this time. And I think that it's not an either-or situation. Can China lead America or vice versa? But I know how the younger generation specifically has either a relationship, I can assume, theoretically, with China on social media and having that kind of, media funding, like a lot of, like videos or music, and that kind of thing. But that's also in terms of like, I guess, what's a popular in American culture. And so that Chinese culture is mandated by American culture in America. So I still don't, I guess, understand how Chinese youth can see American youth in those terms as we're dealing with social media. But I do think that in studying at least the revolutionary process in China, there's that link towards, I guess, the question of peace. Like, that young people here also need to grapple with, like Doc was already saying. But that question is not something that's happening. It needs to develop in order for that connection or that question of does China need, or how can China take from, I guess, the struggle, or like not even the struggle, but the values that stem out of Black America make sense. And I think that it can get there. And theoretically, so there are these linkages and values of civilization between China and Afro-America. I can see that. But I also think that that's something that has to develop a lot more than to kind of have it happen.
I wanted to add in some of my thoughts inspired by your presentations and also the great question about what China has to learn from the Black radical tradition. Because I think also our two weekends taught us the examples of someone especially like Du Bois, who we saw this morning how much China needed Du Bois. And I don't have a complete answer, but I think there's something in both, not just the spirituality, but in some ways, there's a certain consciousness that I think you find in the Black radical tradition that I think China found in someone like Du Bois, as Kathy said, as an elder in the struggle, who in some ways might have understood China and its place in the 21st century more than they maybe even understood their own place in the 21st century. And I think actually with Serafina, what you said, in some ways I was also thinking that I think the greatest gift that the Black radical tradition and figures of the Black radical tradition could give to China and has already given is clarity and the spirit of unity. And I think especially after the second panel, when Dr. answered the question about how Xi Jinping is talking in terms of world development, and then that's kind of a change as well. That's a new thing. I think that's when the gift of unity, and we've talked so much about even the music, like the Jackson 5 saying come together, we can figure things out, we come together. I think that's the gift that the Black radical tradition can give to a country like China and a civilization like China. And I think in this epoch of world development, as more and more as just someone like Xi Jinping talks about how everything is interrelated, I think that's how I see how China needs the Black radical tradition, but also I hope that China also remembers and will remember figures like Du Bois and Robeson who set an example for unity, principle of unity, not just for us as Americans, but also for the Chinese people too.
Yeah, that's what I found important about that triad that we keep talking about with the people, the government, and the party. And I think that culture is an important kind of glue in a way of understanding how that system functions, because it is about values, it is about how you see the world in your particular life world, and how to deal, like in Arthur's presentations, with yourself and the present. And yeah, no, I agree that those links are there. But they do, as it's developing, I think they can be connected. Especially, I'm optimistic about that, what you say.
Yeah, I also think I would add that what you guys have said reminds me of what Du Bois talks about in saying that Black America has a double consciousness because it understands itself and it understands white America. And this is Baldwin too, that he can see the white man for what he is, but the white man cannot do the same for the Black man. And this positioning in the heart of empire and the most antagonistic imperial force against humanity in America and in the West offers a consciousness to China as it's rising, and its people who are determining their place in history.
And to add to that, a lot of, artists, I was just thinking, also travel, to China and vice versa. The issue now is that culture is part of the propaganda machine. That is a device for, the state to tear away of those links. But I'm just thinking about John Coltrane or Alice Coltrane going to India, and then there's Ravi Shankar and that kind of situation. And the same thing goes with what you guys have learned with Mao Zedong and the question of culture. These links are still here. And again, I feel like it comes back to ideological struggle in this country in particular. But I think China is at a different kind of place where it can also deal with these ideas easily. But are they at the moment? I'm not sure either. As in, I just don't know if they're thinking the culture in America as important as Chinese culture at the moment, as it's also developing what that is. But they're still there.
Are there any other questions or comments?
This is where I think the concept of world development is very important. because world development is human development. It is not, as we used to think, primarily the economic and social development. And that was a conversion of Marxism and Leninism. But today, in the 21st century, it is human development. And this is why outstanding representatives of civilizations are very important. And Kathy and I were sitting next to each other while the video of Du Bois in China. First of all, what was so striking to me, and there are a lot of videos, enough videos of Du Bois, I don't ever remember seeing him smiling so much. He was filled with joy over the achievements of China. And the whole thing was very moving. I could just, seeing Mao serving Du Bois's plate with Mao's, with his chopsticks. Mao serving Du Bois. And I think that has to be rekindled. And I agree with the way you put it, Serafina. The state has intervened. So if you want to know black culture, you have to go through the U.S. government.
Right.
It's not like with Du Bois, the Chinese Society for the Friendship Among People. And they and Madame Sun Yat-sen invite Du Bois to China. Is there something like that today? I don't know. And if it is, does it occupy the same place in Chinese society that it did when Du Bois went? But I do agree that black culture and civilization, just like Arthur when he showed that compatibility between Buddhism and King, this is why it's hard. It's hard to call King a Christian, or a Buddhist, or a Hindu, or Muslim. He was transcendent. I think that is a deep part of black culture, and it is suppressed in this country. And it's being replaced with something that is so anti-us. But I agree, human development means that increasingly culture and music and the artist will become the representatives of people, replacing even politicians.
Not to keep going. I don't mean to. Okay, well, I was just thinking that because it's like the thing with this question, it also it deals with the total situation that people are in. Like if there's still poverty and war, then what is the artist if not dealing with the questions of people or if not touching the heart? And I think it's like a twofold question. There's jobs on both ends that have to happen, on the Chinese and in America. Internally, for the artist to understand, and for, I guess, really anybody to understand what's going on, but also to have those relationships on those principles of peace, which is universal. And I don't know, I was just thinking about that because it is not a simple process into that question.
And risks have to be taken. When Du Bois went to China, it was illegal to travel to China.
Right.
And as you know, Du Bois had just both times. No, not in 36, I don't think. But but the thing is that Du Bois had just defeated a legal case that could have put him in jail for being, quote, agent of a foreign government. And as Du Bois always said, I'm not an agent of any government, I'm an agent of peace. And I like that concept. And I think what you just mentioned, Serafina, we don't have to be agents of governments to be agents of humanity. And the artists might be the best representatives of us at this time.
Would anyone else like to say anything? Okay, well that concludes our panel. Thank you everyone